this journey together of listening and learning about the Appalachian heritage and culture of African American people in far western North Carolina from author, artist, activist, humanitarian Ann Miller Woodford.
Thank you so much. Good morning to everybody, or good afternoon now. This storm is really brewing out here, but we are going to work for peace. That's the whole point of our getting together, is to learn about each other, to have conversations that make a difference in the world. I'll just start right in. My daddy went to a white man's house to collect his pay for a job that he'd finished. And when he knocked on the door, a woman came to the door and saw him and turned to her husband and yelled, "There's a nigger out there to see you." Well, of course, that infuriated Daddy, but his faith, his deep faith, his prayers, and our mother's love helped him to become a forgiving person for things like that. That was sort of rare to be heard about him. Um, on Father's Day in 2017, I put a message up for my late dad on the Facebook page that a friend made for him. And I wrote about his background and what all, where he came from, where his parents came from, and all of that. And I also told about how he and my mother met. My mother came over on a pickup truck from Franklin, North Carolina, with a bunch of girls and boys to a church meeting. And Daddy said as soon as he saw her, he knew that was the woman for him. So they met, and then he asked her, could he come to visit her in Franklin, which is was across the mountain. And she said, well, you have to ask my mother. So when he asked, she said yes. And so they were married in 1945. And I mean, yeah, it was in 1945 when they got married. And then I was born in 1947, my sister next to me in 1949, and my sister Nina, who lives in Charlotte now, was born in 1956. So we are a very tight knit family, and it goes all the way back to our grandparents and to our other relatives. When my daddy was a young adult, he just decided that he wouldn't go to church anymore. But Mama convinced him to go back to church. When it wasn't very long after that he became a deacon. And Daddy served as a deacon for about 60 years at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Andrews. Um, he listened to the scriptures, and a sort of an aside was that our daddy was not could not read and write, but he was very smart, and he remembered scriptures like you wouldn't believe. So I asked him one day, how did you learn these scriptures like this? And he told me that a man came and took him out to a mountainside and gave him all these scriptures. Daddy could quote them beautifully. And one of them said, but thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and and shut the door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. Well, he would go across this little stream that we called a little branch to the outhouse, and we called it a closet. And he would pray. Sometimes he was praying in the spirit, and Mama would say to us, hush, young'uns, your daddy's talking to the Lord. Daddy served at Mount Zion faithfully for, as I said, about 60 years. The congregation used to smile when Daddy would stand up and say, at 70 years old, he'd say, well, I've made my 10. And people would say, oh, yes, that's wonderful. And then he became 80, and he'd still say, well, I made my 10. And they would say, yes, 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 because they realized he'd made 40. And it went on like that until my dad made 10, which was 90 years old. And we are so happy that he was there for us all those years. Daddy was rewarded to live those years. And we understood his strong faith and how he lived his Christian life. White, Black, and Native American people respected my dad because he respected himself and he cared about people. He was hired to build fires for our little one room, one teacher, all Black school that my that I went to, and that my sister Mary Alice went to. Mary Alice started at 4 years old, and my sister Nina also went to that little one room, one teacher school. Daddy left in the wintertime. We used to have real snows. Snow fell back in those days. We don't have snow anymore, just a dusting across the ground. But he would step in the snow on his way over to build the fires at the school and to walk to work when he didn't have a vehicle. And we would step in those footsteps, and it kept snow from going into our little brown high top shoes. So Daddy, I'm very pleased that I'm able to walk in Daddy's shoes, in his footsteps, because of the high respect that he gained throughout the region. One of my friends wrote on his Facebook page, I definitely miss getting to sit with him and hear stories from his youth and gain pieces of wisdom for today. He was so precious, and I feel honored to have known him a little bit. This was a white lady in our community. And then another white lady said, unforgettable. When we were small, we would hear his wagon coming to our house. Mother would let us run to meet him. He would let us ride in his wagon and ride back to the end of our driveway on his wagon. What a thrill I will never forget. An African American woman says, Mr. Miller was one of the most kind persons I've ever met. He was full of love and compassion for everyone. He never had a negative comment or unkind word to say about anyone. He truly loved everyone. He was truly a man after God's own heart. I miss him so much and appreciate the love he showed to me and my family from the first day we moved to North Carolina. If only we could all have the love of people that he had. I love my friend and I will always hold him dear to my heart. Rest in peace, Deacon Miller. That was Kimberly Boykin. These comments really give me hope. Um, Even though people have discriminated against and treated us unjustly for so many years, it will take, in my opinion, it will take the good-hearted white people to use their white privilege, which we could talk about. Maybe you'll ask the question about it later on, to change the discrimination that goes on in our country. Well, when I was in my mid-20s, I came home from Ohio, where I lived at that time, to visit with my parents in Andrews. I really felt the new freedom. I was just had a failed marriage, but my business was working really well. And I had named my business Pure Land, and that was named after my mother and father. And Pure was my dad's name, and Margaret Ann, my mother's name. So I called my business Pure Land Incorporated. That was a combination of their names, and it made them feel proud. And I was there to show them that I was trying to make it in this world and be somebody they could be proud of. Grandpa's cousin had died in Tennessee, and so I volunteered to drive them, Daddy and Grandpa, to the funeral in my brand new Cutlass. It was a blue and white Cutlass Salon, an Oldsmobile. And oh, I was so proud of myself. Listening to Grandpa telling one of his wonderful stories. He could tell some fantastic, fascinating, and just marvelous stories. And the way he told them, it was just, it transformed you. You were just excited to hear what he had to say next. And then all of a sudden, Grandpa was in the middle of one of his stories. And I say, this man who always seemed to walk tall in Andrews and in our Happy Top community looked up and he saw a sign that told us that we were in Ducktown, Tennessee. His reaction really stunned me. I had always seen this precious man. He was as a gentle giant, even if he was a slight of physically slight. Um, but he became mush in the passenger seat, and I couldn't understand what happened. He said, "We're in Ducktown," and his voice was shaking, and he had a fearful expression on his face. And Daddy said, "Oh, it's okay, Daddy. It's all right. I've been through here several times." And then Daddy reached over and touched me on the shoulder and said, "Just be sure and slow down. You don't want the law to catch you here." The history behind those words hadn't entered my mind. For many more miles, there was a very uncomfortable silence in the air. I began to connect to some of the so-called tales of Grandpa Cleve sitting there with me, of his past and what had happened on that particular day. He told us about a Black woman who was found dead on the train with her own stockings stuffed down her throat in Blue Ridge, Georgia, where I had to go to the doctor yesterday. There was the awful story of the Bowens family and others who were removed by force, at gunpoint, from their somewhat comfortable or profitable farm lives in Cumming, Georgia. Grandpa's work for the Southern Railroad had forced him to drive a team of mules and horses with a loaded wagon through the backwoods of the Tennessee and Georgia into Cherokee County, North Carolina. He had chosen to ride in the woods because he was afraid of going on the roadways because of the danger that whitecaps would bring to any Black person who was in an area like that, and especially at night. I think about it. I just use my imagination, and I can see him going through these woods, and I can hear him going to the mules or the horses, and the creaking, and the wheels and the bed of the wagon shaking, and the loud beating of his heart as he drove the load back. It must have sounded like thunder to him. And he had to look over one shoulder and then over another. He also told us that when he returned back from World War I, it was a very difficult homecoming. He said, "Before we left, white women hugged and kissed us, and the men slapped us on the back and said, 'You're going to fight for freedom and democracy. When you get back, life will be different. You're serving your country in order to receive equality.' But he said, we returned to the same prejudice and racism, and sometimes it was even worse than before, because we came back with such optimism, really expecting equality. Even wearing a uniform, you were still just a nigger. Jobs for colored veterans were still low paying, unskilled labor, such as ditch digging, clearing brush, peeling pine bark, and hauling sewage, or even babysitting white children. The story of the 1912 racial cleansing in Cumming, Georgia, Forsyth County, is mentioned in my book, When All God's Children Get Together. And I think that those who had a chance to read the sections that I suggested will see that I did not mention other national cleansings in the book. But there are two white authors that, if you care to find out more about what happened there, documented this torturous, horrible story of my family and the 1,100 Black men, women, and children who were banished from North Georgia in 1912. The National Book Award finalist, Patrick Phillips, wrote Blood at the Root, A Racial Cleansing in America. Congressman John Lewis wrote that Phillips delivers a vital investigation of Forsyth's history and of the process by which racial injustice is perpetuated in America. Daddy recalled what his family told him about being banished from Cumming, Georgia in 1912. My dad had a fantastic memory and could just tell you stories, and they were all backed up by my research. He happened to say, when he was talking about it, he said, as he was talking, he said it was in 1912, and that was when the Titanic went down. And I was like, what? And I didn't know that. And so I followed up on it. Sure enough, that's the year the Titanic went down. In the 1850 census, there were 7,283 free people incoming in Forsyth County and 1,027 slaves. The Black population after the Emancipation Proclamation grew, and it caused uneasiness with the race haters in the region. In September of 1912, a terrible incident happened, and it was that a young white woman was raped and found dead. Three young Black workers were accused and arrested. One, a 16-year-old named Robert Edwards, was dragged from his jail cell and lynched on the town square. And after a one-day trial, two other teenagers were hung. Without evidence, there was no proof that these young people committed the crime. A siege of the Black prosperous homesteading community was planned and carried out by the night riders called Whitecaps, a gang of racist vigilantes. Elliot Jaspin, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, wrote a book called Buried in the Bitter Waters, The Hidden History of Racial Cleansing in America. Racial cleansing took place all over the United States. There were statements, leave now or die. Groups of white people of many different economic levels created plans to drive out Black people from their communities. Burning and killing at will, they drove thousands from their homes and businesses with public statements about making their communities racially pure. Or, as in the case of Cumming, Georgia, they wished to be the whitest county in the United States. And most of these communities are still all white to this day. I highly recommend these two books. If anyone wants to learn about the unjust and unequal treatment African American people have endured throughout our nation, they also authenticate the information that I've written in my book. Now, you can understand when I tell you these stories, why panic overtook my grandpa that day in the car when he realized we were in Ducktown, Tennessee, because it had been a place of great terror for African Americans. That town and a place called Copper Hill, Tennessee, were areas that my grandfather had to pass by or pass through when he was traveling up to North Carolina. And they were called sundown towns. That was places that really spell danger for Black people. Almost half of the states in the United States have had sundown towns. There's another book by a man named James W. Lowen, who wrote about the sundown towns. And I was planning to talk to you a little bit about Wilmington, North Carolina, and places like that, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida. Those places I was planning to talk, but we never have enough time. And so I apologize that we won't go into any more details about that, but I can probably answer some questions about some of that at the end of this conversation. This man wrote Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism. And a sundown town is an all-white community, a neighborhood, or a county that excludes African Americans or Blacks, Jews, Native Americans, Latinx people, Chinese, Japanese, or other minorities, and sometimes people of a different gender. This segregation was supported by posters that were outside the towns. As you drove into a town, there would be a big poster up that said the N word. If you come here, you better be out by dark because we will not protect you. Most of these places were sundown towns were in the West, in the Midwest. And even though the South has this name for having so much discrimination, these places were set up to keep Blacks from coming in. And always they could come in and work. And they were usually just in their endangerment was by harassment, threats, violent encounters, and even discriminatory laws that were passed. North Georgia, East Tennessee, and Western North Carolina has so many sundown towns surrounding us here. Cherokee County, Andrews, and Murphy. I've never heard that they were sundown towns in any manner. And I believe that's why when my grandfather came here, he was so surprised at how he was treated so differently than down in Georgia. When he asked a white man if he said he got up the nerve to ask a white man, do you know if there's any land around here for sale? And the man said, yep, I got some right up here in Andrews. So he showed grandpa up to the area that then became Happy Top, which was the Black community that he founded. It's an amazing thing to know that there are at least 25, when I was doing my research, at least 25 sundown towns or ethnic cleansing that took place in our country that have stories behind them. And there are so many more that we'll never know about. For many years, there in this place, there was a place called Graham County, that's about 25 miles from where I live right now. And they have two towns. One of them is Robbinsville, and the name Robbinsville just rings a bell for so many Black people who knew that there were signs that didn't allow you to go into, if you were Black, not to stay there after dark. But there was one armed Black man who lived there for many years. The TVA built dams over there in that area, and they brought in Black men to work, skilled laborers to work there. But the unskilled workers, the white unskilled workers, didn't like it because those men were getting paid more money than they were. And they actually had communities set up where they built communities for the white workers and communities for the Black ones if the white workers came in from outside, but most of them were from right in that same area. They burned down the school and church and chased out all of the Black people except for Trixie, whose name was Eli Williams. And Eli stayed there, and he was a bellhop over at the Topoco Lodge for all those years. Some time ago, back in 1987, a group of people called the Rainbow Gatherings, that they'd meet all over the nation. A group of people who believed in peace, love, and unity, and there were hippies and just people of all different races coming together. And they met in the Nantahala Forest in Graham County. And someone saw one of those signs that said the N-word, don't let the sun set on you, in Graham County. And so they ended up in court having a federal court case over this. But unfortunately, I've searched and I have not been able to find yet what the outcome of that case was. I'm going to change a little bit here to the Negro Motorists Green Book. It was an international travel guide that was published from 1936 to 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. When I remember when I was in high school in Asheville, I went to a boarding school in Asheville. The dietitian would always fix us a bag lunch to take on the bus when we were traveling home. Anyone that was traveling on those buses to leave from Allen High School to go away for holidays needed a bag lunch. And that was because they did not want us to leave the bus to try to go into a restaurant or convenience store, because they usually not serve Negroes anyway. As late as the 1970s, my husband and I were traveling from Columbus, Ohio down to Andrews, and we came into an area called Topton. And I was about to pump gas when the man said that my husband couldn't go in the bathroom, and he would not allow us to use the bathroom or come into his store. So these counties were not included in that green book. And that was probably, I would say it was because the African Americans that left from here, from our area, knew of a lot of the racism that went on in this region of North Georgia, East Tennessee, and Western North Carolina, especially in because they were rural areas that they weren't going to travel here anyway. When Victor Green, he was a postal worker in New York City. He was a strong community leader in Harlem of New York. He decided that he would put together this book, this guide for people at first in the segregated New York area. They could use it to get around and know that they could find places they didn't want to be humiliated or embarrassed or sometimes jailed on trumped up charges. And so there, those dangers, he was trying to help people with that. And it worked for so many years. Um, for about 30 years, I think, his book came out and it became an international guide so that he could tell people in other countries as well how to get around safely. It would show gas stations, eating places, sleeping places, and all kinds of services and entertainment sites. Um, there were so many sundown towns and vagrancy laws that were passed, that his book was really a necessity for any African Americans that decided they needed to travel in this country. Um, he he decided once the Civil Rights Act was passed that it was no longer necessary to print his book, and so it's very difficult to find an original copy of the Green Book at this time. When Rebecca and I were talking, we talked about how much time we might need for this, and that she wanted to hear, you all wanted to hear about the insurrection in or called a coup d'état in Wilmington. Um, and for I think everybody on here probably knows, but a coup is a sudden violent overthrow of an existing government by a group that is intent on removing the government that is legally in place. And unfortunately, we don't have enough time to really get into all those. And I have 3 or 4 stories that I could tell about the very dangerous ways that African American people have had to live in this country. Um, I believe that it's going to take true love, caring for people to change discrimination the way it is right now. And I just want people to remember that when you're looking at a person of color, you're looking at a person just like you. And it doesn't matter if you're a person of color looking at another person of color. You need to understand that that person cries the same color tears you do, though that person has the same pain in their bodies or in their hearts that you have. And so I'll sing this little verse of this little song called that we sang at church so often when I was young, and I still lead it sometimes at my church. It's called Remember Me. Remember me. Remember me. Oh Lord, remember me. I came to Jesus as I was, weary and worn and sad. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. Songs like that have carried my people through because we sang them at church together. We held on to hope, and we still hold on to hope right now that discrimination and unjust inequality will be removed, and we can all work together to build our country. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Anne. Um, I would really like to just open it up to the floor again for people to share what really stood out from the information and the heart that Anne just shared with us. And so we welcome you to come off of mute, and we will cease recording so that everyone can feel again in that safe space of sharing.